Sombra terrible de Facundo, voy a evocarte, para que, sacudiendo el ensangrentado polvo que cubre tus cenizas, te levantes a explicarnos la vida secreta y las convulsiones internas que desgarran las entrañas de un noble pueblo. Terrible ghost of Facundo, I am going to invoke you so that, shaking off the bloody dust that covers your ashes, you rise to explain to us the secret life and the internal convulsions that tear out the guts of a noble people. You have the secret. Reveal it to us. So begins Domingo Faustino Sarmiento's Facundo, perhaps the most famous work of non-fiction in book length completed in Latin America in the 19th century. I have assigned you to read Facundo because it is a foundational text for understanding Latin America in the 19th century and perhaps in the 20th as well. I had to read this myself when I was a very new Latin American history student in college. It is widely assigned and widely read. It is a wonderful book for understanding the politics of early 19th century Argentina and mid-19th century Argentina, and for understanding some of the basic political divisions that were found in most of the countries of Latin America throughout the 19th century. It is also a wonderful example of non-fiction that probably isn't all true. This is a political biography introduced and concluded by a political manifesto. In reading this book, you will see, what does Sarmiento like? What does Sarmiento dislike? How does Sarmiento think that countries should be? What is his yardstick for measuring the right behavior of people? You're going to look in this book, you're going to see clothing, you're going to see attitudes towards work, various other things, and you're going to notice them, and very quickly I believe that you'll see a pattern arise. Sarmiento hates Facundo. This will become clear immediately, if it hasn't already, by him having a terrible ghost. Why does Sarmiento hate Facundo? That's your job to figure out. That's why we have this book. It's relatively easy to read and grasp big interpretive concepts from. Now, you don't have a book that looks like this. This is the Spanish edition published in Mexico in 1991 that I bought in college. Most of you will be reading either the ebook or just online from Google Books. The translation that you get online was done by Mrs. Horace Mann, or Mary Mann. Mrs. Horace Mann was part of a couple, she and Horace Mann, that did tremendous work for the advancement of public education in the United States and tried to export some of their ideas to other countries. Argentina was one of them. Sarmiento had met them while he was on a diplomatic mission in the United States and attempted to bring some of their ideas to Argentina later on. But that's getting ahead of our story, the diplomatic mission. At the time that he wrote this, Sarmiento was a youngish exile, a bit younger than me, in Chile, where he had worked as a newspaper editor and in similar kind of writing professions. He was from one of the peripheral provinces of Argentina and had opposed the rise to the dictatorship of Juan Manuel de Rosas, who is a ally and later more or less successor of Facundo Quiroga. Why he opposed Rosas and Facundo, and then why he left afterwards, is for you to figure out from the book. You can also figure out as you read why it's totally appropriate that the translation of this book was done by someone involved in education, educational reform and advocacy. Sarmiento eventually won. He became president of Argentina in the 1860s, and during part of the rest of his life after the presidency, he was superintendent of schools of Buenos Aires. And for many people, that would seem kind of strange, kind of a come down. but it's totally appropriate for Sarmiento, and as you read the book, I think you will see why he might have been a good fit, and that may have seemed interesting to him. Now, things about Sarmiento that you won't find in the book. One, because it hadn't been invented, was that later when he was president, he had a tremendous mileage of telegraphs constructed in Argentina, all over the country, enough that somebody's written a book just about that called Obsession with Wires. Sarmiento, the telegraph, and one other kind of wire. In the late 19th century, someone in Argentina sold a brand of barbed wire with Sarmiento's picture on it. And as you read the book, I believe you will see that it is also completely appropriate for Sarmiento to have his picture on barbed wire. Notice why. Come back to the forum at the end of the week with answers, perhaps, to that. So, a little bit about, I'll have to take this down, a little bit about Argentina before we move on to a bit more general stuff. Remember that Argentina is next to Chile, so Tierra del Fuego here, Strait of Magellan. Argentina is shaped roughly like this. Here's the River Plate, there's Uruguay, Chile on the other side of the mountains, Uruguay here, Brazil up here, Paraguay more or less here, a couple of big rivers, Paraná goes like that, that's the Paraguay, and the Rio Uruguay comes up like this, and then this whole thing is known as the River Plate. It looks like part of the ocean, but it's actually a river. It's fresh water. Cities have taken their drinking water from it. It flows. It's not the ocean. This area here is the Pampas, all in here, and it's also the province of Buenos Aires, and the province of La Pampa today, but the province of Buenos Aires was kind of like that. With the city of Buenos Aires here in a position to control the traffic up and down either of these rivers, and in a position to become kind of the logical entry point for immigrants, for foreign goods, for anything that might come in and out of Argentina, is likely to end up there. There were proposals through the 19th century to maybe try to make Bahia Blanca down here a bigger port. They didn't happen. Later on in the course, you'll see the railroad network of Argentina once it was built after 1870, centering on Buenos Aires as well. Look in the book to understand how arguments over the role of Buenos Aires were part of the war and ongoing political conflict before and after the war. Okay, well that will mostly, the interior provinces didn't necessarily want to be ruled from Buenos Aires, and exactly how that would happen, a central government in Buenos Aires, one central government that controlled everything, or a federal system in which the various states or provinces centered on the various big cities that Sarmiento mentions in the book would have independent sovereignty and power of their own and be in a loose confederation. Sarmiento, well, you'll see which side he was on, and perhaps you'll see why. The next thing that's important to understand as you go reading this book is that at the time it was written, excuse me, I need to pull a book out from behind me. At the time it was written, books based on travel were quite common. Serious books based on travel, not amusing travel books, although there were those as well, but books where somebody had traveled and studied and then wrote a book such as this one, The New World Compared with the Old by Townsend. This is about 1850, I think. And it's one of the oldest books I own. Townsend argues in here basically that the Americas are better societies than Europe, partly because they're more equal and more open. He has an interesting page in here where he compares the size of the White House to the size of Buckingham Palace, the size of the Emperor of Brazil's palace to the much larger palace of the Emperor of Austria, and so on. The most famous of these travel works that you may have heard of in American history is Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, it's usually translated as, from a study of the United States in the 1830s as he traveled all around, and then wrote this big book about how Americans lived, behaved, governed themselves, and so on. Sarmiento himself wrote a big book in Spanish directed to Argentines and other Latin Americans about the United States in the 1860s. Benjamin Vicuña Maquena of Chile similarly wrote a book about the United States and parts of Europe based on having traveled there, and with all sorts of reflections for political and economic innovations that their home countries might want to adopt. And those are just a few examples. So when Sarmiento starts off telling you what the landscape is like, and then goes into talking about the economy and the people, that was a genre that his readers would have been familiar with. And they would have understood what was going on. And they would have understood that this was a way of describing national character, trying to understand what countries were like. Sometimes countries commissioned books like this themselves, such as the Atlas de Guide. The Chilean government in the 1830s and 40s, roughly the same time as Sarmiento was writing, commissioned a Frenchman named Claude Guy, who in Spanish is always called Claudio Guy, to travel the length and breadth of Chile with some artists and scientists and so on, and come up with a descriptive atlas of the whole country, of what each place was like, what the different landscapes were like, who the people were, what they were like. And this was partly as a way of understanding the country so as to govern it more effectively and more powerfully, increase the power of the central government, but it was also a way of trying to define the nation of Chile. Chile had kind of an easy time. It's quite isolated from other dense settlements by the ocean and the mountains and the desert on one side and the very cold, wet forest on the other. But still, convincing people that they were Chilean rather than, say, from Concepcion or from Copiapó took some work. And so they did various studies like this to attempt to do that. And one of them, actually I think I'll walk up a little closer so you can get perhaps a better view. One of the aspects was a painter named Rugendas, did a whole bunch of sketches and paintings of different parts of Chile and different aspects of Chilean life, a lot of which were then engraved and printed with the study. And this is a 1980s reproduction of some of them. And if you can see in the picture, I think you'll notice there's kind of a party going on. It's kind of a countryside bar. There's a Chilean flag up. It's probably around Independence Day in September. Notice that the people are portrayed kind of sympathetically as representatives of Chile. Notice what they're wearing. A lot of them have on big wool ponchos called manta de Castilla. They have different kinds of possibly straw hats. And then as you read the beginning of Sarmiento, and he talks a great deal about clothing, notice he's in Argentina, this is Chile, but some of the issues are the same. Think about how the clothing he describes fits the people in this picture. If I can get a hold of a copy of this, I'll put it up online. I don't know if I can get this one to scan. So, a little bit about Sarmiento, a little bit about the genre, and the things you should look at. The last part is a bit about liberals and conservatives, the basic political bands that you'll find in Latin America in the 19th century, and that we're looking specifically at this week and part of next in Argentina and in Mexico before 1870. And these are the liberals and the conservatives, parties that called themselves that in many cases. These are not the same as we use liberal and conservative today in the United States. They're somewhat more similar to the way Latin Americans and Europeans still use the words, but even there it's a little bit obsolete. So think of them with capital letters. If you want, you could think liberal and conservador to make them seem different from what you might think of as liberal and conservative. So the roots, conserve, to preserve, to save, to keep what's old and presumably valuable. Liberal is about freedom. So these guys, they were all guys really, tended to be much more in favor of keeping things the way that they had been for a long time. And these guys were generally interested in change, in changes that would increase certain people's freedom. So for example, liberals were often in favor of abolishing slavery. Some of the Latin American countries abolished slavery when they became independent, some of them, but Brazil didn't do it until 1888. In general, the liberals were on that side, but it wasn't a huge issue in most countries, so I'm not going to put it in the list. The biggest thing that in every country marked a difference between liberals and conservatives was this: the position of the Roman Catholic Church in society. So put this little southern Chilean carving from Chiloé in southern Chile there, and we'll put church. So their attitude towards the church. In a nutshell, the liberals wanted the church to be less powerful, and the conservatives wanted it to stay powerful. What did this mean in practical terms? The liberals wanted to establish civil marriage so that you could be married by a government official. They wanted to establish civil registry of births and deaths so that it would be the government who would keep track of the major events in people's lives, as opposed to the church through baptismal, marriage, and funeral records. They wanted to establish often civil cemeteries where the government would take care of having people buried rather than the church. The church would be allowed to come in and have ceremonies, but wouldn't own the cemeteries. Generally, they wanted to have state schools or public schools as opposed to church schools. And often, the liberals were in favor of freedom of religion. Not always, and particularly not so much at first. And the conservatives not only wanted a state church, but they wanted to prohibit the existence of other churches. They were no longer going to punish people for wrong belief through the Inquisition, as the Spanish government had done during the colonial period, but they were going to prevent the existence of visible churches, church buildings, foreign clergy dressed as clergy, this sort of thing. So there's one. Everybody in this story is Catholic. There are no Protestants. There are essentially no Protestants, at least. There are essentially no atheists. There are essentially no Jews. Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, not to speak of. Everybody's Catholic. It's just a question of the conservatives believing that the clergy should be very powerful, and the liberals believing that they should be less so. That the church, in fact, should be more independent of the state, perhaps, or should be dependent on the state in the way that the state would control it to keep it less powerful. The other things that the liberals and conservatives tended to disagree on are trade. Can't write. I'm trying to get in the picture and not block the thing, but they tended to disagree on trade. The conservatives tended to be protectionist, and the liberals tended to be for free trade. And look in Sarmiento's book where he talks about anything that might be related to trade. He talks about it some directly and some indirectly. The liberals tended to be involved in export and manufacturing, commerce, imports, and so on, as a job. The conservatives tended to be landowners with old-style traditional estates. The liberals tended to be more in favor of, say, trying to have more modern ways to refine sugarcane, this sort of thing. The liberals tended to want a big electorate, and the conservatives tended to want a very small electorate. Meaning, the conservatives, if they were in favor of elections at all, wanted only a few rich property-owning men to take part in them, and the liberals wanted, in some countries, less rich men, in some countries, any literate man over 21 usually, and in some countries, any man over 21 at all. This was the Argentine position from very early on, actually. There is one other thing here that won't fit a little tiny blackboard. And this is that conservatives in most countries wanted one very strong president who controlled the whole country, one Congress. And the liberals tended to believe in a federal system where the separate states would have some separate powers and autonomy. As you read Facundo, you will see that in Argentina it was backwards. The liberals were the ones who wanted a strong unitary state. You'll see them referred to as unitarios or Unitarians or Unitarists. And the conservatives who wanted a federal system. Think about the geography and politics of Argentina as you read and figure out why the conservatives of Argentina were the federalists, where everywhere else the liberals were the federalists, and vice versa. That is the bulk of what you need to know about these. I'll see about giving you a typed list of this in Moodle for reference, just in case you can't easily see it on the screen. I just want to go on now and say just a few words about Mexico, which is the other thing that we're doing this week. I've just asked you to read the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which won't take you very long. This is the treaty that ended the war between Mexico and the United States. Because you're spending so much time, I'm sure, with Facundo. Things you want to think about Mexico. One, I've put up a PowerPoint with explanatory text in there that you should be able to read kind of like a photo essay, a lot of artwork and photographs of the key points of Mexican history, which I won't try to repeat here. So read that, think about how it fits with Econ, think about how it goes with the attempt to consolidate a new nation. And you'll see in there the liberals wanting one thing, the conservatives wanting another. Just kind of disagreeing fundamentally on what society ought to be like. And as in Argentina, fighting wars. Unlike in Argentina, they fought a whole bunch of little wars, little revolts, rather than one long, grinding civil war like in Argentina. And while there were some separatist revolts in different provinces, in Mexico it wasn't clearly this place against this other place, the way it was in Argentina. You'll notice the figure of Antonio Lopez de Santana, known to American history books as Santa Anna, who was president multiple times. I'm not sure if he ever filled out a whole term without either quitting or being forced out. He served for the conservatives, he served for the liberals. He was what we call a caudillo, a kind of strongman ruler with a personal following, and without much strong, in his case, not much strong ideology other than his own power and perhaps Mexican identity. Caudillos can have a strong ideological position, but he didn't. He was kind of like a populist caudillo, although the word populist didn't really exist yet. So notice him going in and out of power, and imagine he's going in and out of power much more than I've actually narrated in that PowerPoint. And also notice notice when you're reading the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that there are a few things that are perhaps odd to our modern ears. One is the United States retains the right to navigation on the Colorado River down to the Gulf of California, which is lovely when there's any water in the river, but usually there isn't because the United States takes it and sends it all to California and Arizona. Another is that the U.S. Army, at the end of the war with Mexico, was allowed to wait in the highlands of Mexico until the end of the 6th season before going down to board ships at Veracruz. The sick season, this is the time of year when there were a lot of mosquitoes and yellow fever and malaria became common. This is the sick season, and it was important enough that it was mentioned in the treaty. Kind of look through the treaty. You don't have to try to remember every article, but get a sense of what this agreement is about. Clearly the United States won, but Mexico did get a few things in return, at least on paper. And also notice that it's this treaty that sets up New Mexico to have 2 official languages, for example, by allowing specifically the language, religion, and culture and landholdings of Mexicans to continue in the United States. A lot of those landholdings ended up being more or less stolen by Americans who used legal dodges to try to show that these Mexican landowners didn't actually own the land. But in theory, they were supposed to keep all their land. It was just supposed to be a change of sovereignty. Okay, we're done. I will see you all later. Pardon me, I have no cameraman. I'll get up and turn this off myself.